So yes, I just need to outline some housekeeping issues for everyone. So before we begin, and hopefully that will make today's discussions more fruitful. The objective today is to really reignite the discussions that we in IPPOSI and a number of other patient organizations have been having over the last number of years on this topic. We certainly hope today's discussion will encourage those on all sides of this particular topic to not only appreciate the value of involving patients in this area, but to hear some of the concerns and some of the ideas that will lead to potential solutions in this area. So we have two patient-led panels of people with both experience of being involved, and from the patient and the patient group side, but also from the state and the industry side. And I know that a lot of patient groups and advocates with interest in this area are logged in, and so everybody's welcome. We're also joined today by many of our scientific and research and industry members who have a direct or indirect interest in this topic. So today's format is that it's hosted on Zoom, and it is hopefully being live streamed on the IPPOSI YouTube channel. A recording of this discussion will be shared publicly from Monday of next week. And as I said already, there's two elements to today's discussion. There are two panels, and I'll introduce each panel in succession when they're at their allotted time. There's 45 minutes in total for each panel, which includes 15 minutes for Q&A. So the questions from any participant can be put to the panel in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen in your panel, and you should be able to see the questions that are put in by others. And you can upvote questions which you think are important by clicking on the thumbs up icon. So please do give this a try, as it'll mean we'll be able to get to the questions that are most relevant to you. The Q&A box is being moderated by my colleague Laura Kavanagh in IPPOSI, who will be turning to at various stages to see which questions are bubbling up to the top, as well as probably specific questions which we feel are really relevant to the discussion. We are also using our social media channels for this on Twitter at the IPPOSI at IPPOSI with the hashtag patients involved. And as I said already, it's being streamed live on YouTube. So without further ado, we're going to go straight into the first panel. And the first panel today is on the topic of the patient experience of involvement in both assessing and reimbursing new medicines in Ireland. We have a number of contributors and panelists, and I'll just very briefly introduce them. First is Aoife Kerwin. Aoife is the Research and Advocacy Officer in MS Ireland and is also the patient representative on the HSE Drugs Group. We are also joined today by Dave McMahon. Dave McMahon is the CEO of the Irish Skin Foundation. That's the patient organisation who advocates for people with skin conditions, and David is also an IPPOSI board member. We're also joined today by Professor Anya Carroll, who is the Professor of Healthcare Integration and Improvement in University College Dublin, and is also a consultant in the, I have to say, the fantastically looking new rehabilitation hospital out there in Rochestown Avenue in Dublin. And Anya is also the chairperson of the HSE Drugs Group. We're also joined by Katrina Nikutcher, who is the Senior Health Technology Assessor and Interim Patient Engagement Lead at the National Centre for Pharmacoeconomics, the NCPE. And Katrina is also the National Clinical Data Manager for the Irish Hepatitis C Treatment Registry. So we have a couple of questions to the panelists, and we're going to turn first to both Aoife and David. And I think it's fair to say in recent years, both the NCPE and HSE have taken steps to improve how patients are involved in the medicines assessment and reimbursement process. And really what we're trying to do is to get from both of you a sense of what the experience of you both has been at the different stages in the process in which you've been involved. So if I could turn to Aoife first in terms of your own experience. I mean, how good or how positive or how has your experience been as part of the HSE Drugs Group?
Thanks, Derek. I have to say I've had a very positive experience as part of the drugs group so far. So it would have been in 2018, the Quality Improvement Division in the HSE would have sent an email around to try and get 2 patient representatives to put an expression of interest forward, and I did. And I was selected as one of the representatives. So I did receive training in advance of actually attending a meeting of the drugs group, to explain how it worked, to explain what QALYs and ICERs were, and that kind of technical, the technical things I didn't really know enough about at that stage, I suppose. So I did receive that initially. There's a lot to it. It's not an easy. It's not easy to take on fully. So, but I was offered support afterwards, and I'm still offered support if I do want to ask anything or I want to clarify what something means. In advance then of a drugs group meeting, I'd receive the documents about a week before, which gives me time to read through them. So we'll receive, as part of that, then we'll get the patient group submission if one has been put forward. So you get time to kind of read over that stuff before you attend the meeting then. And then when you do, you're given lots of information. So they'll talk about the drug, what it's licensed for, what the history of it has been, if it's been to drugs group before, what change there's been since. So it might be that they came to a better agreement with price or something like that. You look at the treatment comparators. So you look at the kind of various bits and pieces anyway, and then they'll talk as well about the condition itself and what how the condition impacts people, and then what the potential of the medication would be. Then you'd look at also the potential budget impact of that, I suppose. And then it's followed by a discussion with the members. My vote counts just the same as anybody else's, which is great. So the value of my vote is the same as any of the other committee members. And something that I really like about it as well is that the voting is done in a kind of a random order. So, you know, sometimes if let's say everybody else was voting ahead of me as the patient rep, I might feel swayed, maybe, I don't know. I haven't, but you know, you could maybe sense that if it were the case. But no, to be fair, it's done one way for one medication, and then the next one you might do it in reverse order, and we just never know who's going first. So it's a really nice way to do it, actually. The group themselves have been really, the atmosphere in there it's really welcoming. Again, I wouldn't be afraid to ask a question if I wanted to be fair. And there are clinicians in the group, there are people who understand the complexities of things at a far greater level than I do. But to be fair, I would be happy to ask a question and to seek clarification on something if I wanted to. So overall, my experience has been really positive.
Well, that's great to hear, and it's certainly something that for those of us who have been advocating for these kinds of opportunities for patients, it's certainly wonderful to hear that experience has been a positive one. Rather than ask maybe you specific questions at this point, I might turn to David just to see. I mean, David, we've asked David to come today because you've been involved at the NCPE patient evidence submission stage in the process, and I know a number of patient groups have been through that process now at this stage. So maybe David, if you could give us your perspective on things at that stage.
Sure, sure, Derek. Well, I suppose just to provide a bit of context, first of all, the Irish Skin Foundation, we represent people who are living with or caring for different skin diseases, in particular people living with inflammatory skin diseases like psoriasis or atopic dermatitis or HS and others. And just to give you sort of a sense of our organisation, we have 3 full-time staff, we've 2 part-time health promotion staff in the office. And we have nurses who work in the evening with patients and on an appointment kind of model with a helpline. So that's sort of the sense of the scale of our organisation. Not very big, but we would have a very active board that is a blend between patients and healthcare professionals. And the reason why we started engaging in this process was really because there is a new, say, first-in-class treatment for people who are living with moderate to severe atopic dermatitis available now, and it's kind of the first breakthrough treatment for this condition in decades. That's sort of the sense of this is where we entered into this process, and we were really like I saw the development of the submission process, and I knew that we were going to be engaging in the submission process maybe probably 18 months before we actually put in the submission. And I suppose, I mean, like just in terms of our organization's sort of motivation around it, I mean, we really wanted to do as good a job as possible on the submission, because at the end of the day, behind the process, there are real people who are like desperate, I suppose, for access to life-changing treatments. And I guess we felt that, our job is to make sure that people can get on with their lives uncompromised as possible by the condition, particularly if a treatment can alleviate the symptoms. So I suppose we wanted to shorten the time. We want to shorten the time really between, when patients can get access to the treatment in real life. And that's our main motivation. But we want to make it possible as well for patients that we work with to meaningfully influence the process in some way. But we want to do that through a kind of a dual approach, through inquiry and through advocacy. And I suppose, like at the end of the day, and this is one of the nice things that is on the NCPE site, is like they want the life experience, they want an understanding of what it's like to live with a particular condition. And I think it's great to see that's front up there, that they really want patients to contribute and to kind of communicate all of that. Now, I suppose, we started off with a little bit of a blank canvas, and I was in touch with Katrina's former colleague Claire, and Katrina herself, I think, at different occasions about what we might need to do, and we actually had a very positive experience with the NCPE, because they gave us as much sort of guidance and direction as we needed, without maybe telling us exactly what we needed to do all of the time. So I guess the Irish Skin Foundation, we kind of took a very belt and braces approach to the submission process. We wanted to make sure that we were able to kind of reflect people's lived experience, but also provide actual data, so that it wasn't simply just the views of people who were living with moderate to severe eczema, but it was married with actual Irish data. And then I suppose that presented us immediately then with an obstacle, which was the data obstacle. And that's something I'm sure that many patient organizations and many individual patients who are trying to engage in this submission encounter, because data is kind of tough to come across in Ireland anyway, and certainly data for atopic dermatitis was lacking. So we kind of entered into it with certain amount of trepidation, but also we were very, very motivated around it. Now, I suppose our experience was that it required a lot more work than we anticipated, just in terms of time. And thank God, in a way, we had our health promotion team, Michelle Dolan and Michelle Greenwood, working in the office, because we wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise. We probably spent, I would say, in excess of maybe 200 hours, I would say, in putting together the submission over 18 months, because we had to go and find a data set, and we had to survey patients. And in the end, I think we got contributions from over 450 people who were living with atopic dermatitis, in order to marry the patient experience, actual narratives, with data. And that was a huge challenge, but also hugely valuable for the organization and for us understanding even more about the people that we represent. So I suppose that approach, along with the research that was needed, along with maybe trying to consult with different clinicians that we were in touch with, members of our board, again, going back and forward to the NCPE, we did feel we were lucky in that we were quite well supported by both patients and the clinical community. But also we did feel that the support that we got from the NCPE was useful and was well balanced for what we required.
Great, thank you, David. So, overall, I think positives for your organization, challenges from a resource perspective, but overall, I think there are impacts to be felt. I think the word impact is important here, because for anybody who has been championing, I guess, patient and public involvement, it's the ultimate impact of that involvement is sometimes slightly hard to get feedback on or to get evidence of. So, and I might turn to the other two panelists in this respect. So maybe first to Anya Carroll. So Anya, what is your experience as the chairperson of the HSE Drug Group been from this whole process?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I didn't pay IFA any money in advance of this webinar. So it's lovely to hear that IFA has had a very positive experience. And I suppose what I would say, Derek, is that I was on the old drugs group in my previous incarnation as National Director of Clinical Strategy and Programs, and I'm now chair of the new committee. So I have lived the change from not having patient representation to having patient representation, and the contribution that both Aoife and Michael make is excellent. It really feels that we have got a comprehensive and diverse perspectives and opinions around the table, and as Aoife has indicated, there are robust discussions around the table, and I think that now it's always a continuous improvement process, if you like. Do I think that it's perfect? No, but we continue to take feedback about how we can do things better. So my experience has been excellent. I think we have been blessed by having Aoife and Michael on the committee. Their preparation and contribution has been extremely valuable, and it's really nice to be able to kind of look back and see how with the efforts of many, how appropriate patient and citizen representation on so many different committees. So whether it's to do with research, whether it's to do with reimbursement, whether it's to do with design and delivery of services, to see how things are really changing. And it's a huge pat on the back to all the different organizations who have been working so hard over many years to see this actually become a reality. And it's great to see that the HSE have got the patient's charter. There's a real commitment, especially within the office of the Chief Clinical Officer, and as Aoife referred to, within the Quality Improvement Division, to really get patients involved in all these different aspects of design and delivery and decision making to do with health and care generally. So I have to say that I've seen the before and I've seen the after, and the contribution has been huge and extremely valuable.
Thanks, Anya. That's extremely good news, and great to hear from your perspective, having seen the old and the new. It's maybe the next question is, what does the future hold for this, and where are the opportunities? But I'll turn to Katrina, and that word impact, in terms of the impact of the patient submissions and receiving them. And obviously the NCPE has a certain role and a certain remit, but has there been particular impacts that you've seen from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, the role of the NCPE is to facilitate the submission of evidence into the HSE Drugs Group. And it's definitely a process that we're continuously reviewing and refining. So it's all based on engagement and feedback from patient organizations who, give us feedback on what their experience has been, being challenges or positive experiences. associated with developing their submission and going through that submission process. So we do that at the end of every single patient submission that we receive. We send them a questionnaire and ask a series of questions about what that experience was like at that immediate point in time. And we collate all that information annually, and we do a report internally in which we publish also, to help us understand a bit better about, is there anything we can do to improve this process, or are there any aspects of the process that need refinement or improvement? And we have taken on board a lot of these, including like refining the questions that go into the patient submission, developing guidelines and tip sheets, and then also having a patient representative who's there in the NCV, who's contactable, who can help answer queries or do the Zoom calls and help support patient organizations, because it's going to be a challenging time when you're trying to bring together all of these different opinions and experiences of various patients within your organization, and just trying to, make improvements where we can based on that engagement and feedback.
Thanks, Katrina. So with that in mind, it strikes me just from something that David said about 200 hours. So 200 hours is a lot of time to invest into something. And as you said, the NCP, insofar as possible, tries to assist with the submission process, but it's primarily the responsibility of the patient group that is there. But obviously, from certain disease areas, or even particularly for smaller patient groups, the ability to make it as comprehensive a submission just isn't there. So David, would you have any advice for any patient groups?
Yeah, I suppose first of all, I mean, I've like Derek has kind of heard me say this before, but I mean, the word, patient organization, like, is such a kind of a short, it's such a sort of shortcut kind of thing to say. I mean, the patient organizations they're so broad. There's so many different kinds, and they can be fully formalized charities, or they can be, 5 people sitting around a kitchen table. It has to be. One of the things, I suppose, is about the submission process is you don't really understand, but certainly we didn't understand at the beginning, what is expected of us as a patient organization. As I said, we want to do as best a job as possible. We're trying to influence this process in some way to shorten the time for patients to get access to this treatment, right? So, and the 200 hours thing, I suppose that was our particular experience and our way of doing it. But I suppose we don't really understand what the impact of the submission is. It's brilliant to have an opportunity to make a submission. It's amazing to have an opportunity to try to influence things and interface and engage and all of that. But what does it mean? What's its weight? There's probably an opportunity for better feedback on what does your submission mean in the context of the process? And I suppose from our point of view, I guess I would feel that there's a bit of work to be done there. I think that's more. I know that's difficult to do because you don't want to set up a situation where you're trying to say, well, this is a good submission and this is maybe a weaker submission. I don't think it's about that, but it's about trying to understand what impact it has. If you put all of that time, all of those resources, particularly as well, if you an awful lot of people who helped us kind of put together elements of our submission, put in statements that were really very charged, very emotional, it was difficult for them to write about. When we go back to them, what do we say to them? What is the impact of their contribution within this process? And I think that's not fully understood. We're later, we made our submission to, the NCPE back in, August, I think 2019. And we're a year and a month on, and we don't know was that worthwhile. I can't really say, because we have no follow through yet. And I suppose, you know, a cynical perspective could be, well, you know, is this just a process? Is this a way of sort of siphoning off the frustration and the desperation and the need to communicate our patients into an operational process? And it has to be more than that. Now, I don't believe that that's the situation, but when within an environment where you don't get any further feedback that is beyond the most kind of, I suppose, perhaps administrative type of communication, you wonder where the value lies in it. And I think improvement can be done, it can be made in respect of that.
Okay, so can I point that directly at Anya Carroll? Is there anything, Anya, that you can say about the impact of the submissions? And I presume that I'm working on the basis that the patient submissions are submitted in full to the drugs group and they have full sight of the entire submission. Is there anything that you can speak about in general in terms of what the impact of that submission has been at the level of the drugs group?
What I would say, David, is that all evidence is considered. So in full, everything is considered by the drugs group. And the experience that we've had of getting those submissions has been immensely valuable. The value of the lived experience is really, I think you would agree, coming to the fore generally. And the value of that is very important. Now, weight, what weight gets put to that? That's a very good question. We don't apply weighting per se, and I don't think that any other country have got a process for doing that. But it is certainly considered and it is certainly valuable, and there is nothing like a story, a lived experience to really focus the mind. Now, I think your point about feedback is a very good one, and that's certainly something that the drugs group and indeed NCPE, myself and Katrina can bring that back to our respective groups, and I'm very happy to do that.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add there as well that definitely that's all of what's been spoken about in the last few minutes. It definitely is coming back to us in terms of feedback from patient organizations. Once the submission has come to us and we've forwarded it on to the HSE along with our report, the question is always, what happens next? When will I hear more information? And unfortunately, that's the next phase outside the remit of the NCP. Our role ceases essentially at that point. And we do provide information on our website to try, include further information about what has happened with the medicine post that point. But other examples of things that have come up similar to, about the differences between smaller patient organizations versus larger ones that might have a research officer or a policy advisor working within these large, well-funded charities or patient organizations versus smaller patient organizations. We're definitely seeing a difference in terms of the level of support that's required and that or consultation that's required with smaller groups. And at times you're seeing things where if they're in a smaller, more support group rather than an organization, that they don't necessarily want to share personal experiences that might be very private to them. And if they're in a smaller group, they may not want other people within that support group to know or be aware of what they're experiencing with their particular disease or with the medicine. And it's hard to sometimes give them that privacy, I suppose, when they are making that submission of evidence together as a group. So that's definitely one of the challenges that we're seeing come to the fore quite a lot, especially with more rare diseases where there's smaller patient numbers within a patient group. So we're working on things like that as well in the background about how we can support and facilitate that.
Okay, thanks, Katrina. Before we go to the Q&A, I just wanted to bring in Aoife at this point in terms of, that point that Katrina was making about the differences in patient groups, and certainly for rare disease patient groups, there is a technology review committee there to look at things more specifically. So my understanding of your role on the drugs group is to be that, I guess, generic patient. You're not there to look at things from a specific condition specific point of view, but I guess it's that combination of the submission from the specific group of the condition of interest for the treatment, plus your own perspective, is that kind of combination. But I wonder, is there anything that maybe you could suggest for how maybe that could be improved from both, I guess, the specific point of view, but also your own point of view?
To be honest, like the patient group submissions that come in, like in my experience, what I've seen is like the real difference that they can make is like, it's what you don't see in the data set. So like those kind of personal experiences, as Anya said and Katrina mentioned also, like those personal experiences, although they're difficult for people to sometimes put across, they're actually very important in that process. And also it is a way for people to get to explain why they might need this specific thing. And, you know, it is certainly worth asking the question as well of like, you know, what the value of that submission is, and for the amount of effort it takes for the likes of, let's say, smaller organizations and things like that that don't have the same level of resource. What is the value of the patient group submission for them? And I think that, you know, some work could be done around supporting smaller organizations and, you know, even the larger patient organizations to better understand how they can best go about their patient group submission and where the real quality for them is, because that's very difficult for patient organizations and patients themselves, of course, to understand. So I think some support around that would be fantastic.
Okay, and I guess one selfish question that I have for you, Aoife, is that something that gets said to me quite a lot is that, but your patients will always want access. It will always want a positive decision. And in terms of your own experience of this, is that something that has been played out in reality?
So when I first joined drugs group, I thought to myself, but I'm the patient representative, so I'm just going to like be on for all of them. I'm going to be there to like say yes to everything. And the reality of the situation is very, very different, because, you know, if a submission comes in and there's room for NCPE to go back to try and get, or for primary care reimbursement service, for them to go back and try and renegotiate for a better price, or there's flaws in the data and we're potentially going to pay for something that might not be as beneficial as we think. If you're willing, if you put all your money in one pot, in that, it takes from another group. You know, there's balance that has to be achieved. So I'm there as a patient representative, but I'm there in the public interest. Do you know what I mean? So you have to be fair, and sometimes things don't make sense, and sometimes you have to make the decision that makes the most sense, even though you'd like to say yes to everything. The world doesn't work like that. So it's been a very steep learning curve, for sure. But I've come to the realization that being on the side of the patient is, you leave your own, like I have a medical condition myself. I leave that at the door when I go in. I'm not there as the person living with my medical condition. I'm there to ensure that patients across the board get what they need. And if we're willing to pay a colossal price for one product, it means that we don't have the same level of resource then for other products that could be beneficial. So it's about, you know, maintaining that balance. Does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, the opportunity cost is always mentioned, and that somehow it strikes me that you're very conscious of that in your own deliberation and your own decision making. So and as part of that committee, that needs to be, I think people need to be aware of that. So I might just turn at this point to Laura Kavanagh on the Q&A, and we'll see what questions are coming in. Laura, is there particular questions that are being upvoted?
Hi, Derek. Yes, there's really two kind of questions coming through. One speaks to what Aoife has just talked about and the small organisations, but the question really is what provision can be made for these small organisations, especially if they're unable to engage with the current patient submission process. And there's kind of a sub-question around that to the NCP, as in how many submissions are currently received, and is there any indication whether they're from big or small organisations? So there's that question, and then there's another question around sufficiency. Are we there yet? And if not, what more can be done? So leave it with you.
Okay, well, I might, if there's a first question first, I'll direct that to Katrina. Is there particular improvements or supports that might be put in place, or that the NCP might be already doing for those smaller organizations?
Yeah, and definitely in the new year that we're in with the COVID era, we're doing a lot more work on Zoom calls where we're reaching out to patient groups and spending time with them, working through the guidelines and the tip sheets about how to complete a patient submission of evidence. And we've obviously got a completed template up online as well. But just having that dedicated person there in the office to, you know, answer any queries and just continuously offer that support throughout the whole process. We feel it is working, and the response we're getting from smaller organizations is that it is working, but the challenge will also always remain that it will take time to complete these patient submissions of evidence. And sometimes when you are a smaller group, it might not be the case that you would need to do the bigger amounts of work that larger organizations might need to do to ensure that they've captured the views of multiple patients within their organizations.
And
just
sure,
Derek, if I may just to say, so I suppose, you know, at the beginning of the process, from our point of view, we were kind of wondering, well, like, what kind of submission are we going to put in here? Are we going to put in a submission that is simply going to be the, you know, maybe the perspectives are 7 or 8 patients who were living with a moderate to severe level of disease, or maybe did we need to talk to a health economist? Like, we weren't really sure what scale was, like on a spectrum of kind of what we thought would be required. On the one hand, we thought, well, look, is this going to be something that is going to be completely almost scientific in terms of its character, or is this going to be more of a reflection of the subjective experiences of individual patients? And in the end, we kind of came down in the middle, because we felt that we needed to take both sort of, you know, into account, and try to balance it that way. So, you know, I mean, from the tenor of the conversation we're having, you know, now you can see, I think I see that actually both different types of approach are valued in the same way. If I'm, you know, reading between the lines, you know, and you know, I just, in relation to what Aoife was saying there about the difficult decisions that have to be made in terms of resources, and you know, particularly for very costly treatments that may become available. Like, I think that's an understood, you know, obstacle. But then there are treatments that are like inexpensive. Particularly, they're inexpensive in comparison with other things that are already available, and there are the same obstacles for those types of treatments too. So I suppose, you know, it's a very kind of nuanced type of situation. But I kind of feel that like a little bit more feedback, a little bit more sort of a little bit more information back from the whole process would be very useful for everybody, and particularly for giving patients some kind of idea of predictability about when they may, or if they may ever have access to any of these treatments. You know, there are lots of treatments that are available in countries all the way throughout Europe that are not available in Ireland, and we just, you know, we can't always, we don't want to be in that position. You know, but I do concede, of course, we can't have absolutely everything because there are finite resources. But we need a more nuanced or perhaps more tailored kind of communication about individual cases and individual treatments that are being advocated for.
Thanks, David. And maybe just to point that back to Katrina, do the NCPE have any plans to, I guess, release kind of information about maybe either how popular the submission process is, or indeed how the impact of the submission can be either tracked through the process? Is that something that you're planning to do?
Yeah, absolutely, and it is something we include when we update our guidance about, examples of what has been used, what tools have been used to create summary information to be put into patient evidence dossiers. But ultimately, the NCP isn't present in the HSE drugs group decisions or discussions. We are an independent agency that has to remain independent from that decision-making process. So it's not something I feel would be the place of the NCP. It's possibly more of the role of the HSE to work in that space around what is how information is valued or whatnot.
So then passing it over to Anya. So Anya, you'll remember 18 months ago, we put together what we call the patient charter for the medicines reimbursement and assessment process. And there were a number of I guess, time points along that where patient input and patient involvement we felt would improve the process. So, and whereas we initially, I think, received some good feedback from the likes of senior management in the HSE, I think the impact of COVID has led to, I guess, a lack of information coming back. But I'm just wondering, from your perspective, is there ways in which that communication process can be improved?
I think I would go back to the feedback point. I think that having channels of two-way communication are really important. I'm not party anymore, Derek, to what happens outside the drugs group. I'm an independent chair, but any feedback like this, I think it's important to feed that back to the HSE, and I'm certainly happy to to advise that we had this webinar today and to feedback. I'm happy to do that.
Thanks, Anya. I might just go back to Laura. Is
Derek, yeah, really just the other one coming through strongly enough is alternatives to the current involvement model. So we've talked about submissions, we've talked about things like that, but is there anything else we can do to make sure that the patient voice is representative or is represented? Alternatives, I guess.
Okay, I might point that to either David or Aoife. Is there any ideas that maybe through your own experience of it as to how maybe alternative mechanisms could be explored?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I think this process is a good process. That perhaps it like anything else, it can be improved, perhaps. But I think from my perspective, we don't want to see a situation where it's about who shouts loudest. This is about reality, about resources, difficult decisions, and what's best, and how we can collaboratively make proper informed choices together as patients, healthcare professionals, policymakers, budget holders. I think it may not be a perfect process, but it is better than protest and anger, and which I don't think is the way that we ought to do business in this country. We are a small country. Like, the scale is different here. There's huge amounts of challenges, just even with the health service, with the commercial kind of backdrop of all of these things. So none of that is easily bypassed. None of that is easily soluble. So we have to try to. This is in a way a kind of a new way of doing things, and we're only at the beginning of doing it. It's only a kind of a nascent process in certain respects. So, you know, I just think we have to kind of keep plugging away to make it better. And this is the kind of forum, and these are the kind of discussions that help shape that.
Thanks, David. Aoife, do you want to have maybe the last word on this?
No, if I could just say, like, I'd agree with what David has to say on that. And I suppose the reality of it is, and I'd mentioned earlier on, that the patient group submission, really the value of that is telling us what's not in the numbers, and that those stories matter. They do. And I think that, you know, from my perspective, in terms of, you know, from my side, I think it works quite well. But I do think that there could be some sort of a process to understand how that feeds in, and how you turn that kind of evidence into a numerical thing, and how that can be put into the equation in a better way, other than just informing us of it, but how could it actually be added into the mix? So I think that would be something that could be done.
Could I just add one last point to the discussion is this obviously is a process for the patient groups that we identify and engage with, but a challenge that we were definitely aware of is that there's only a proportion of all the submissions, total submissions that the NCP reviewed, that receives a patient submission. We're aware that there's a large chunk of submissions that don't have a patient voice. And that is a challenge that we're finding. We're trying to engage with groups like yourself, IPPOSI and Irish Cancer Society, to help us identify even those smaller support groups. So that's something that, you know, is a critical piece that we're working on in 2020 and 2021, is trying to, if anyone could give us feedback on it, or, you know, there's a lot of people on this platform today, to get in touch with us, the NCP, if they have any ideas about, you know, there are any kind of mechanisms that we could look to other than just the standard Twitter. Not everyone's on Twitter. I only recently joined myself. So, you know, it would be really helpful to get that kind of feedback.
Great. Thanks, Katrina. Well, there's over 100 people on this call that I hope everybody heard that call from the NCP. So,
Eric, forgive me
sure,
if I
Anya,
could just jump in. Apologies. I think that, you know, there've been, David in particular has raised a very important point, and it has come up in the questions as well, about the those that don't have a loud voice. And it made me think about, you know, this is something that we have been talking about for years, not just in the area of access to medication, but generally, you know, and not just in the health and care arena. How do we engage better generally? So if it's in the research sphere, wherever it is, why do we struggle so much with we're all human beings at the end of the day. We're all, you know, citizens of this great country of ours. So why do we struggle so much to have conversations and to seek to have mutual understanding and appreciation of different perspectives? So there's a big research question right there. How can we do this better? But what I would say from a drugs point of view is that we're trying, and we're open to any suggestions and new ideas, and any suggestions that you have will be considered and considered gladly.
Thank you, Anya. So I'm just conscious of time, and I think we've run over the 45 minutes, but I hope that everybody's got something from the panel, both the panelists and the participants. So with that, I'll just thank the members of this panel. That's Aoife, David, Anya, and Katrina for joining us today. We're going to switch over to our second panel. So there might be just a little delay where we bring in the second panelists, but our technical team here will start doing that now. And we can begin that panel shortly. I hope the members of our first panel can stay with us as audience members, because certainly the second panel is going to flesh out some of the I guess the challenges really on the access front. And so I'll just wait just a few more minutes. I think we have everybody. So yes. So the second panel today is again a three-person panel, and we're delighted to have people coming from patient, science, and industry in keeping with our IPPOSI remit. And if I can introduce the panelists of our second panel, just, sorry, there's a little gap in my own screen. So our second panel is focusing on the topic of the medicines assessment and reimbursement process, new and old challenges. So our panelists today are, our first panelist is Philip Watt, who's the CEO of Cystic Fibrosis Ireland and someone very familiar to us in IPPOSI, both as a board member, but also in terms of our joint authorship of the Drug Iceberg Reports. Philip, you'll remember those vividly, I'm sure. Our second panelist is Susie Geiger, who's the Professor of Marketing and Market Studies in UCD College of Business. And Susie is also a member of Access to Medicines Ireland. And our third member is Jim McGrath, who's the relatively newly appointed Director of Commercial Policy with the Irish Pharmaceutical Healthcare Association at IFA. So you're all very welcome. And I guess the topic for this panel is quite a challenging one. There's lots of different policy and research and system influences on this particular topic. And if I could maybe turn to Philip first to maybe give us an update from your perspective as to where you think the current new and maybe old challenges that are facing the Irish system are currently at.
Yeah, thanks, Derek, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I think this is a huge issue worldwide, and we know the World Health Organization has it as one of their main priorities for sustainable goals going forward. And we're relatively lucky in Ireland in that we're a developed country and we have money for drugs, but I always think of the countries that don't on these occasions. And indeed, even in developed countries like America, where many of their citizens are denied drugs because of cost. But I think what's really positive is I think there's increasing consensus really about the approach going forward. And, you know, it has been challenging in the past, not least for our own organisation. We have had to be one of those organisations that had to be robust about access to drugs to our community. But I'm really thankful to the Irish government that they are supporting that process. But I think the two key issues really are, from a patient perspective, are timely access for patients is really, really important. And we do see the evidence from the WAIT reports that, you know, we're a bit slower getting drugs. And as David said, there are some drugs in Europe that aren't available here as well. And, you know, that does cause some sense of frustration as well. But I mean, listen, the other side of things, the other point is affordability. And, you know, that's probably the biggest concern for governments after making sure that as many people get access to care as possible. And it's a huge challenge. And these drugs often come at eye-wateringly high prices. So there's a huge challenge. But I think patient groups have been very responsible in trying to acknowledge that. And I think we really welcome some recent developments, such as the collaboration with other states in Europe, the Benelux process. I don't know if everybody is familiar with that, but that's basically where Ireland in 2015 joined up with countries like Belgium and Netherlands and Luxembourg and Austria to try and negotiate better prices with big pharma, you know, and so that big pharma can't pick off one country at a time. And I'm talking to a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, they really welcome that process as well, because they really feel there's a lot of duplication in the process. So being able to negotiate with a number of countries at one go, and they feel also in many cases the Benelux process is quite a transparent process, and you know, individual countries could learn from it as well. So I think that's really positive. I think another key challenge would be around the fact that these new drugs are of a different league than they were ever before. And we know that from cystic fibrosis. They're much more complex, and they're beginning to treat the underlying cause of condition as opposed to just the symptoms. With the complexity also comes cost as well. But I think, and pharmacoeconomic people in around the world are saying this, that they need to update their systems to make sure that the HTA process, the assessment process for new drugs, recognizes that these drugs act in a different way and are more complex, and in some cases are heading towards some form of cure, in the most developed cases, and with lots of new therapies coming down the line, like gene therapy and gene editing. It's a really, really exciting time. But so I think there's a challenge for us to see that the pharmacoeconomic economists keep up with that process and translate that into national policy. I'm sure they are absolutely up to date with the policy, but I think for governments to catch up with the assessment processes and so on is a bit of a slower process. And I would totally agree. There's more resources are needed for smaller groups. I mean, I meet at least one group a week around various issues, and they're often it's just one single person or two people. And we're lucky in CFI. We feel we're under resourced, but we have 10 staff. In other bodies they don't have any. So some sort of resourcing process for the smaller groups. I don't think it should be extended to the bigger groups, to be honest. I think we can find it somewhere, hopefully. But certainly some sort of support process to build on the great work the NCP have done recently in terms of, encouraging participation and tweaking the forms and so on. That's really is to be welcomed. And then finally, I would say, there are huge challenges around COVID-19 and the legacy of that, both for the costs for our systems, our health systems, but also because there's less focus on things like access to medicines as well. And also clinical trials have been postponed or delayed. So that's a massive issue. And also, of course, the challenge of drug resistance as well. It's a massive issue, the need to develop new drugs for conditions because the drugs have become resistant. Is really a kind of massive issue, and it's a global issue as well. So I think, I would say there's been progress, but it's great to hear the really positive experience of David and Aoife. But, I think looking at it in a broader way, the experience has been more mixed, and certainly there's been also, as well as the success stories and things going really well, there's been a lot of frustration. Even when drugs get reimbursed, the decision is made, there's often a delay when patients actually receive them. And there's so many factors for that, including the under-resourcing of the reimbursement process itself to bodies like NCP. But as I say, just to finish on a really positive note, I'm really delighted that Anya has been appointed to the post that she's in. I have immense respect for her and her past work. And I think that is a really positive decision. She's a very independent-minded person and a very fair person. And I think the experience of David and Aoife has been really positive as well. If we can work on the other issues, particularly timely access, that would be fantastic. But yeah, challenges, but progress as well.
Thanks, Philip. And I would completely agree with you on the point about Anya. And I hope it's not just down to the Northern Ireland accent. One thing you didn't mention there was the B word, so which I'm thankful for, but I think is coming down the tracks in terms of potential impact on the Irish system. But I might turn to Susie. And certainly, I think Philip's points there about the timeliness and the affordability, and that speaks to, I guess, the challenge that's being faced by all countries, and particularly European countries, both, I guess, the rich and the not so rich. But in terms of the overall EU strategy and the emphasis that's being placed on sustainability, both, I guess, from a patient access point of view, but also from a fiscal point of view, is there anything that you've seen from your perspective in looking at these different markets where Ireland could actually position itself?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for having me. I think it's such a hugely important discussion to be had, especially at this point. I think we're at a very critical juncture, to be honest, in terms of the access to medicines discussion. We have the Irish government negotiations with IFA, the Irish Pharmaceutical and Healthcare Association Industry Association coming up. We have at the European level at the moment, which is very exciting, a consultation on a long-term European pharmaceutical strategy. And we have the renewal of the Innovative Medicines Initiative also at the European level, all coming together in 2020. Now, obviously, all of these processes delayed a little bit through COVID complications, but I think there's a real opportunity now to look at access to medicines from a very holistic perspective. We've already heard a lot today about the improvements that the Irish government and with the help of the patients' organizations obviously have made in terms of the reimbursement process. But the reimbursement process really is only sort of a part of a much, much bigger picture. And I think it's important that when we have these very strategic discussions between the governments, at national level, but also at European level, the pharmaceutical industry and the patient organizations, that we acknowledge that bigger picture. And that starts from, patenting, through horizon scanning, through marketing authorization and reimbursement processes, to actually getting the drugs on the ground. And the WHO always talks about three things. They talk about affordability, access, and availability, and that these three things, obviously they're interlinked, but if we think about them in a sort of a separate way, accessibility or access doesn't always mean affordability, and vice versa. Availability isn't always guaranteed if there is access nominally guaranteed through, for instance, reimbursement. And we see that in the Irish context, that we have drugs on the reimbursement list that actually never sort of arrive on the ground. So I think it's really important that we look at access to medicines issues in the round, in the life cycle perspective of a medicine. And it's a difficult issue because, I think we have rarely an industry where two sort of, things come together to form a perfect storm, which is opacity and complexity. And complexity is increasing with new drugs, gene therapies coming online, personalized medicine coming online, with the sort of the amalgamation of the genomics industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the tech industry. That's bringing us up to a whole new level of questions about access, questions about fairness, questions about regulation of these industries. So complexity is only going to increase. So I think we can, we have the sort of the terrible twins of opacity and complexity, then we can really only work on the opacity piece. And that means, obviously the positive side of opacity is transparency. So bringing in transparency at all of these different steps across the entire life cycle of a medicine, I think, is absolutely hugely valuable. And I think there are various European and worldwide initiatives at the moment that we're seeing that call for more transparency across the life cycle of drugs. And that's something that I'm very, very encouraged by, and that I think the Irish government can contribute to and endorse in lots of different ways.
Thank you, Susie. Some really, really insightful points there. And I would echo those in terms of your point about the I guess, the drugs that go through the assessment and reimbursement process. And very often where patient groups have made submissions and gotten involved in that process, and yet still are being held up and that there's a delay. And I might turn to our final panelist, Jim. So that's Susie also mentioned the IFA agreement, and that has been, we saw the announcement that has been extended. The current agreement has been extended, and there was there was an indication that, in the release statement that that those drugs that had indicated that were being held up, that those are now being fully reimbursed. Maybe you could give us your particular perspective on where things are at with that renegotiation.
Sure, yeah. The answer to that is that a portion of the drugs that are in what we refer to as the backlog in IFA. I fear, of course, that the IFA contributor at the start of this will be much more popular than the IFA that I represent, but so what we refer to as a backlog of medicines, which is the conversation that was had in the first half was really positive about greater patient voice, greater transparency, and really great cooperation between the various decision makers in the drugs group and patient groups. And it sounds like that dynamic appears to be working kind of as it could or should be. But the real access issue occurs after that point, because we currently have patients campaigning for access. We have pharmaceutical companies engaging in price negotiations, coming to agreement, meeting, getting positive recommendations from the drugs group. So clearly the HSE's professional pharmacists feel there is value for money in some of these medicines, but it's after that fact that there's effectively no budget to underpin their funding that is really creating the access issues. And it's even more so because there isn't a kind of a consistent flow behind that. That's where the absence of information and the frustration comes in for both IFA members and for patient advocacy groups. And it's why it's very difficult to kind of give indications of when decisions might happen. So to give the full background to it, you know, I joined IFA in April. I think at that stage we had about 17 to 18 medicines in a backlog awaiting, that had received a positive approval from the drugs group, but it wouldn't have been formally sanctioned any budget by the HSE. 3 medicines came off that backlog that were justified under COVID measures. And I would estimate that a kind of a minimum of 3 will come from an additional pricing realignment, which will drive some savings via the extension of the IFA agreement. But that still will put, I suppose, depending on how you interpret it, you know, somewhere between 12 and 14 medicines that have been approved for funding, have been approved for reimbursement, but there's no actual finance to underpin them to actually give access in the community. So that's the problem as of today. When we also forecast forward to next year, we have some really new innovative medicines kind of coming on stream that have greater layers of complexity. They are many of them would be for rare diseases where, you know, the economies of scale kind of would not work in their favor as regard from a patient point of view. But we have an increasing number of them coming online. So the demand is going to be there from Irish patients without the funding to underpin them. And the conversation that I think we collectively need to have as kind of healthcare advocates is that, you know, it's not even a Department of Health issue or a HSE issue. It's even beyond that. Effectively, the Department of Public Expenditure ceased the reimbursement of positive budget impact medicines in July 2019. And nothing really moved in the system until 3 medicines that were reimbursed under a COVID banner, and some more now will be self-funded from a pricing realignment. So what is actually happening on a long-term basis is the queue of medicines is getting longer and longer. The work of patient advocacy groups is kind of growing and growing as there. So we actually need, I suppose, the state to step forward in, I think we need 2 things. Yeah, there's plenty of things we can do to improve medicines management in order to free up resources for new medicines, and there's plenty of things to be done there. But I think the key to unlocking that is the state setting forward what its ambition around access to medicines can be, because in truth, if we know that the state has a real ambition to tackle the access issues, then it is much easier for both industry groups and patient advocacy groups to row in behind that and to do even some of the heavy lifting. And I think industry is more than willing to kind of step up and to do plenty of what it does to try and improve access all around. It's in the wider interests of everyone. I suppose there would be a fear in industry that we would initiate plenty of practices for which the state would just grab them as savings and not actually distribute those resources into the community to actually improve access. So for the first part of the discussion, I think I really welcome it, and the feedback from our members is so positive about working with patient advocacy groups. But I suppose the elephant in the room is resources and funding, and maybe both industry and patient representatives should maybe be jointly telling that story to government in order to have a better impact, rather than confining it to individual medicines that only have a limited impact for particular communities at any point in time.
Thanks, Jim. And just to clarify that from an IPPOSI point of view, we had hoped to have somebody from the state side, but just in terms of availability, that wasn't for this particular online discussion, but it's certainly something that I think, certainly in IPPOSI, we'd appreciate more information about what the state's approach will be to this complexity issue, but also I think the ambition. And certainly if you listen to Stephen Donnelly's, the Minister for Health's recent comments, I think that there is ambition there. I guess if I was to ask a direct question back to you, Jim, in terms of the extension of the current deal, and I think everybody could acknowledge that in the current context that there was so much uncertainty in relation to the impact of the pandemic on the current system and the ability to find fiscal space to fund new medicines. I guess that there is there's good solid reasons for extending the current deal rather than starting the renegotiation now. From an industry perspective, is that something that was simply down to uncertainty, and that we're going to be in I think a much clearer space in 6 months' time, but maybe what needs to happen in the intervening period to make sure that that new deal, whenever it's made, is far better informed?
So a few things in that. The first thing I'll say, maybe to go back to the previous point, to be fair, that there is a state representative here. I don't think that anyone on the state side would aggressively disagree with my point. I think it's a factor of timing and uncertainty that the time resource of all of our senior health policymakers was eaten up in COVID. So therefore, I think they do want to put their thinking hats on around the access issue. They would feel that they haven't had the opportunity to do so yet because of COVID. So I don't think there's any sort of bad faith in this, and I think much that the Department of Health, etc., would agree with. In terms of what needs to happen now, there's a couple of, I suppose, positive processes that all of us need to make the most of under the extension of the agreement. One is that as part of the extension, we will be engaged in horizon scanning with the HSE, whereby that would at least give some opportunity for, I suppose, the pharma industry to signal to the HSE, this is the pipeline of medicines coming forward. Obviously, the HSE would have to set their own priorities within that. But it would be effectively making a kind of coordinated joint case for the funding of these, because medicines, compared to, I suppose, other areas of health possible investment, they can and usually lead to very traceable positive health outcomes. And in that guise, you know, investment in medicines is certainly an appropriate use of scarce public resources. So that's kind of one point on the futurizing. And the second process that kind of will be underway as part of the extension is the state is putting together, I suppose, a working group on the future of biologic medicines, that what happens to them when they lose their exclusivity. Under the current IFA agreement, they automatically receive a discount, and that is the area that the state has expressed they feel that there is savings potential in that. So I think those two processes should at least, I suppose, help some of the forward planning. But your third point, what do I think needs to happen? I would say that both patient groups and indeed pharma industry could probably be better at telling the overall big picture for how and why medicines are important. Because if you think about it at the start, the medicines budget is funded from current spending in the Department of Health. And plenty of other people, and very legitimately, are in the queue for that type of investment, including free GP care, including, hiring of nurses, consultants, doctors, their salaries, all of that. So there is quite a queue for current expenditure in health. Therefore, the people that I suppose are passionate about access to medicines we could probably work collectively to tell that story a bit better. One thing we've done in IFA as part of it is we have commissioned an actual study on the value of medicines and their overall both health and economic impacts, which will help, I suppose, put some evidence behind that. But I think, for those of us that know where medicines and access is crucial to the health system, I think there's an onus on all of us to kind of collectively tell that story to try to have a bigger impact on the overall fund. I suppose it's the overall funding and medicines management stream. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. If I could maybe take that point and throw it to maybe to Philip. So if it's a case that the case needs to be made better, I'm thinking of the CF patient grouping, and not only have they been one of the ones most affected by the pandemic, but they have also been, if you look at the last 5 years, the differences between the advent of having new and innovative medications, but also in terms of the influence of having good proper data and a registry that can measure the differences and the impacts of these new medications. Is there anything that maybe you'd like to come in from that CF perspective on that?
Yeah, I think just on the last point you made there about registries, absolutely critical. The most important thing we ever did, which was before I became CEO, was to do the Pollock report, and that was based on data from the registry. And that showed the numbers of people with CF, where they were living, the extent of their disease. And I'm so conscious that there's so many disease groups out there that don't have a registry at the minute. And I think it really is a policy issue in terms of helping to stimulate those and resource those registries to become available, because without the evidence, you can't really do anything. And drug companies won't do clinical trials in a country without a registry as well. So a national policy on registries has to be moved up the agenda, absolutely. And I absolutely take the point, but I think, there is a narrative that goes out there. And to be honest, before I got into cystic fibrosis a decade ago, I would have shared it, was like these rapacious drug companies, that they were just out for self-interest and, just money making and so on. And then you get into it and, of course, we all have to be kind of careful about companies that exploit situations and so on. But you realize, the massive amount of resources that needs to go into a new drug, the individual commitments, that now that I've met, it's so many people from different companies, including none which have not with anything to do with cystic fibrosis. you know, the commitment, individual commitment to try and find better medicines. You know, there really needs to be some sort of awareness raising done around the importance and the contribution of industry, as well as academia and, of course, patient groups. So I'm not quite sure how to do that, because there's so much cynicism out there, really, about pharma. But I think it has to be done. I think it has to be attempted. And I think patient groups can't be cheerleaders in that process, but we can give our insights from our perspective, which I think is really, really important. And then just to reinforce the overall message about transparency is, in terms of confidence in the system. The more we can do to increase transparency, the more confidence there is in the system, and the less likelihood of friction, really, in the system, which we all want to avoid. I mean, none of us really want to see ill patients outside the Oireachtas complaining about lack of access. But I think there's a challenge, I think, from the HSE to hear what patient groups are saying, from our perspective. Like, we do have an expertise. It's different from the expertise of people in the HSE. But, we are watching out for what's happening in other countries. And, things like the assessment of how drugs, the assessment of drugs, of these new complex and innovative drugs, is so important. And that you don't just measure a drug on one marker, but you look at it in a much more holistic way, because that's how these drugs are impacting people, in a much more holistic way. So, I think there's plenty of opportunities, and I think this discussion today really adds to the potential of reaching some of our goals.
Derek, can I come in here, please?
Yes, please do, Susie. I was just about to.
Thank you. I just want to push back a little bit on Jim, if I may. I'm not sure if it's a question of telling the story better. I think the government and all its different bodies is very well aware just how important access to medicines is. Again, the discussion at any level of the state and European bodies has been intense in the last few years. But if we always focus on that one piece, and that pricing piece and reimbursement piece, I think we miss out on, a much more strategic perspective that's absolutely vital here. And, we need to mention innovation. We need to mention all the different legal and economic incentives that the industry is getting, and that the state and European bodies are actually not asking for a lot of obligations for these incentives, and I think one of the issues that the European pharmaceutical strategy is trying to assess is, what are the obligations that come along with all the different incentives that the pharmaceutical industry is getting from the state. So again, in terms of transparency of costs, being a really important one, we can't just bandy about figures like, oh yeah, every drug costs 2 billion to get through R&D. We need more detailed costs. We need to alleviate these information asymmetries between the industry and government bodies. And it's only then that we can have these much more informed discussions where we can say, okay, within the overall healthcare budget, there is a very important component that is, medicines, but there are also components such as preventative medicine. There's components addressing socioeconomic issues that actually alleviate the pressure on the medicines budget. So we have to take a strategic perspective here, and we can't just focus on telling the story better, because that story has been told, I think, quite a few times now.
So right into you, Jim. There's a question. So I think it comes back to the issue of trust. And I think that the improvements on the state side of involving patients and having more inputs is to be welcomed and can hopefully build greater trust. On the industry side, is there things that Irish industry can be doing to increase levels of trust?
Good question. I suppose just to take up Susie's point, I mean, I would still kind of stand over what I've said from the point of view of that from July of 2019 to July of 2020, no single innovative medicine was reimbursed in this jurisdiction. So from that point of view, I don't think it's as simple as just telling the story better, but I think that there's clearly some awareness or some policy point that's missing from the point of view of the state, and we all have some interest in doing that. I think there's a lot of things the industry can do, some of which we're trying. I think the future of reimbursements will involve greater pricing, greater prescribing controls over the reimbursements to ensure they can be adhered to within a budget. And I think the pharma industry can be supportive or even pioneering of some of those. I think the future model of pricing is trying to link it to real world evidence and real world outcomes. So what happens at the moment is you kind of have your clinical trials, I suppose, in a limited control setting from which, you know, the data is derived, an application is submitted, and it's assessed by the NCPE and the HSE's drugs group and all of those kind of players. Where it's going to internationally is that, you know, the payments or the pricing reimbursements are linked much more to real world evidence and real world impact, so that the state gets a bit better value for money through pay for performance. And I think that is something that the vast majority of industry would welcome. Where we have, I suppose, a gap in really pioneering that in Ireland is having the data infrastructure at our hospital and our clinical level to justify or to enter into kind of reimbursement contracts of that nature. And that's something that IFA would be very keen to raise and build on, you know, within future agreements, because we're all about trying to give the state more confidence in the ability, in the outcomes that come from funding medicines. So as the technology improves, the data capture also needs to improve. And if while those two things are improving, that enables the state to have much more targeted value for money. And that's something the pharma industry would be very keen to bring to the table. And we're currently in discussions with the National Cancer Control Programme, specifically on a data gathering exercise to see how might a pay for performance reimbursement model work. And if we can achieve things of that nature, and that's where, because what we might refer to as medicines, you know, we're increasingly going to be calling them health technologies in future. I think the industry can even, in some cases, directly contribute and assist the state in capturing that data properly, so that much greater efficiency and value for money can be improved across the system. And if we increase value for money in our use of resources, then it should be possible to treat more patients and have a better social outcome.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I'm just conscious of time, and I realize that that's my fault for poor moderation, so my apologies. And I hope that if we do have some drop off from people, that it's just purely down to my fault. So we're going to open for Q&A now. And I think just in the interest of time, rather than going to Laura, Laura's been very good at prompting me. And there's one particular question that's coming through, which I think would be good to get some response, at least from Jim. And it's that transparency question in relation to how drug prices are set, and also in terms of the state investment in research, and how that can often not be considered as part of drug pricing, or that it can't. There is no real process to uncouple that, it seems. Jim, is there something that the Irish companies in particular can be doing to increase transparency on both of these issues?
Yeah, let me think about it. Where that's a bit more challenging, it is because our HSE, or at least my recent experience since joining IFA, the HSE have been very effective at getting pricing agreements that are well on innovative medicines that are well below the European average. And that's partly done because the pricing agreements are confidential in nature. Pretty much every innovative medicine that has been reimbursed in Ireland in the last 2 years, particularly on the high-tech side, has been under the guise of what's called a patient access scheme, which is whereby the actual price agreed is lower than the typical average price across other EU countries. That is done because it is commercially confidential, and we would have to, if we had greater, I suppose, at least in the opening commercial window or the period of exclusivity, there is, I suppose, I'll put it this way, the HSE have access to all the transparency, and they make assessments accordingly. And from my experience, they definitely only enter into agreements where they see strong value for money that's in there. So to me, the system is quite robust. And to give one example of that, a pricing realignment has just taken place, or is about to take place as of October 1st, whereby over 750 medicines, or all the medicines in the portfolio, including patent protected medicines, are assessed and are moved to the average of EU 14 prices. And one of those has occurred every year for the last 4 years. So I think we can have confidence that the pricing is robust and efficient in an Irish context, not least because the HSE are so stretched for resources. They really have no interest in overpaying for anything that they don't see value in. To the wider point around the public trials and all that, I suppose the search for the COVID vaccine is demonstrating to us just how complicated the process and the pathway of bringing a medicine to market is. It is cumbersome, it is long, it is bureaucratic, as it should be, but it's also with considerable financial risk. So there are plenty of medicines that are trialed that never make any kind of commercialization. From that point of view, it's not quite a straight line in terms of, the public funding goes into many trials, but plenty of it, whether that's successful or not, is not really known and can't be known for quite a few years afterwards. I think it's something that there's an openness and a recognition that, we want to give and ensure the state has full value for money, and there's broad confidence in the system, and I think we're working towards that.
Okay, if I could put that response back to Susie in terms of maybe what maybe have you found? I know you've got a European research grant looking at market failures and things like that, but is there any particular context or countries where you've seen national approaches being taken forward at the European level? Is there good examples out there that Ireland could be learning from?
Again, sorry, Jim, but I have to push back on you a little bit here. I don't think, in whatever, the history of economics, confidentiality is never really guaranteed cheap prices. I think that's a myth. And it's not just me saying that, it's also at the European level, I think there's an awareness that is not the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the regional networks that we're seeing emerging. Philip mentioned Benelux, we have Valletta, we have the Nordic countries coming together to increase the transparency and to decrease that confidentiality, that sense that we can only get cheap prices if there's confidentiality agreements. Again, that I think it is quite solidly proven not to be the case, because how would you know that you get a good price if you don't know what everybody else is paying, you know? So the more we have transparency at a European level, the more we work with other, especially smaller states, such as the Benelux countries, to increase the insights, I suppose, to increase coordination and communication between the states. I think that can only be of advantage, certainly to the Irish budget. The second point that you raised, Derek, or that was raised in the question, is about public investment. And you know, there's a lot of the time there's a sense that the public is paying twice, that they're paying through public subsidies or public, you know, fully public research. I mean, you know, I'm standing in UCD here, fantastic research going on this campus and so many other campuses, and that research is really the cornerstone of a lot of the developments that we're seeing, the innovations that we're seeing coming through eventually, but that are then at that point fully privatized. They have patents on them, and you know, pharmaceutical companies are making a lot of money with them. And there's a lot of suggestions going around at the moment about conditionalities that, you know, Europe or individual states are building in conditionalities into research grants, for instance, that we have, you know, we have a European registry of clinical trials, that we have some sort of traceability of where that money is going and where the drugs eventually emerge. And if it's 10 years later, it doesn't really matter, as long as there's a guarantee that the public then doesn't have to pay twice, once in terms of public investment in research and development, and then twice in terms of the surplus that we're creating through, you know, patent monopolies, actually.
Thanks, Susie. I think some really, really important points. And I can already see the next topic coming up for IPPOSI to work on. I'm totally conscious that we're 8 minutes over, but I will give the last point to Philip, if you want to maybe contribute anything towards what maybe.
Just to end on a positive note, it's just so wonderful what can be achieved now, and our community is going to get access to the new drug in October, and you know, from the experience of Irish people in America who've already got the drug, it is game changing, it's life changing, you know, and the fact that this innovative research is happening is tremendous. I think we have to find ways of stimulating that research more, and you know, I think at a government level as well as at a European Union level, and indeed a lot of research is done which is forgotten about and is never translated into therapies. So you know, we need to do more to harness the research that is done already and to translate that into therapies. But it's a really positive time for some groups, but then on the other hand, we're just so conscious for other groups. It's soul destroying and still battling away to find a diagnosis, never mind a therapy. So, you know, patients and highlighting the issues to government will mean progress. But it's really important that we do that in a way which is a partnership with other patient groups and no one left behind, I would say, you know, and particularly the rarest of rare disease groups, you know, that we have an absolute moral duty to ensure that no one is left behind. Thanks.
Thanks, Philip. I couldn't wish for a better closing point. On that note, we're 10 minutes over, but I'd like to just literally thank everybody who's been involved in this, the panelists, the IPPOSI organizers, in particular, Laura, Debbie, and Mel back in the office, and everybody who's logged in today. I will just two points about, this is being recorded and will be released on Monday through the IPPOSI YouTube channel, but also on the IPPOSI website. And we're using this discussion to inform an IPPOSI response to both what Susie mentioned about the EU Commission consultation on their future pharmaceutical strategy, but also on the future EFA agreement. And I would like to echo Philip's comments about the importance of rare diseases in terms of both of those policy initiatives. One is that I know that the orphan drugs regulation is something that the Commission is going to be looking into, and certainly something in IPPOSI that we would be hugely supportive of in terms of the regulation and the importance of keeping a distinct focus and targeted policy approaches for orphan drugs, but also on that kind of broader healthcare policy initiatives and the importance of keeping a degree of equity into not just the Irish system, but in terms of how EU policy can influence the Irish system. So, so just a very brief reminder to people that the IPPOSI online webinar series is continuing, and just check out our website for future events. Our AGM and conference is coming up at towards the end of the month, and we will be releasing details of that. My own Twitter feed looks particularly busy now, so I was just going to spend some time going through that. But thanks for everybody for contributing, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you.